They said it was suicide. Flying wooden biplanes at treetop level in absolute darkness, dropping bombs on searchlight batteries that could tear canvas wings to ribbons in seconds. Yet she flew through the war untouched 850 missions without a single bullet hole in her aircraft, without a scratch on her skin. The Germans called her Nachthexe, the Night Witch, and they awarded an Iron Cross to any pilot who could shoot her down. None ever claimed it. Her name was Nadezhda Popova, and she was 20 years old when she first climbed into the cockpit of a Polikarpov Po-2 biplane in the summer of 1942. The aircraft was a relic even then, a crop duster with an open cockpit and a wooden frame covered in plywood and canvas. Its maximum speed was barely 94 miles per hour. It carried no radio, no parachute, no guns for defense, and no metal armor plating. The only weapons were 2 bombs strapped beneath the wings with wire, released by hand when the navigator yanked a cable. These were the machines with which the Soviet Union expected young women to fight the most mechanized army the world had ever seen. If you want to discover how one young pilot survived 850 missions in the deadliest skies of World War II, hit that like button right now. It helps us bring these incredible untold stories to more history lovers around the world. And subscribe if you haven't already, so you never miss another forgotten chapter of courage. The regulations were clear when war broke out. Women could serve as nurses, as radio operators, as clerks. But Nadezhda had learned to fly at 15, had soloed before she could legally drive a car. And when the Wehrmacht rolled across the Soviet border with 4 million men and 3,000 aircraft, she wrote directly to Stalin demanding to fight. She was not alone. Thousands of women sent similar letters, and eventually, grudgingly, the Soviet High Command authorized 3 all-female combat regiments. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment would become the most decorated of them all. Training was brutal and abbreviated. The women had 6 months to transform from civilian pilots into combat aviators. They learned navigation by dead reckoning, bomb release calculations, emergency procedures for engine failures and fires. They learned to fly in formation at night without lights, to find targets using only a map and a stopwatch, to survive bailouts over enemy territory. Many washed out, some died in training accidents. Those who remained were hardened by the knowledge that they were entering a war where the life expectancy of a Soviet pilot was measured in weeks, not months. Their mission was psychological terror as much as tactical destruction. The Po-2 biplanes were too slow and too primitive for daylight operations, so they flew exclusively at night, attacking German positions when soldiers were supposed to be sleeping. The tactics were simple and utterly terrifying. The pilots would climb to 8,000 or 9,000 feet, cut their engines to idle when they were above the target, and glide silently toward German lines. The only sound was wind whistling through their wing struts, a strange whooshing noise that German soldiers said sounded like a witch's broomstick cutting through darkness. Then came the whistle of falling bombs, the crump of explosions, and before searchlights could lock on, the pilots would restart their engines and disappear into the night. Except the searchlights did lock on. And when they did, the canvas and wood of the Po-2 became death traps. Anti-aircraft guns would open up, filling the sky with tracer rounds and shrapnel. Other pilots in the regiment were shot down, their aircraft disintegrating in midair or spiraling to earth in flames. Nadezhda saw friends die, saw aircraft explode before her eyes, watched parachutes that never opened, and wreckage that burned until dawn. The losses were constant and devastating. Some nights, 3 or 4 crews would fail to return. The regiment would hold brief memorial services at sunrise, then prepare for the next night's missions. And still she flew. Multiple missions every single night. Sometimes 8 sorties before dawn, sometimes 12. Once, on a single night in 1943, she flew 18 missions without stopping except to refuel and rearm. The ground crews would work frantically between sorties, hauling bombs from storage dumps, pouring fuel into the biplane's tank with hand pumps, checking cables and control surfaces by flashlight. Nadezhda would gulp down tea, study the next target coordinates, and climb back into the cockpit while the engine was still warm. Then back into the darkness, back into the searchlights, back into the storm of flak and tracers. The mathematics of her survival seem impossible. 850 missions over 3 years of war. That meant flying nearly every single night, often multiple times per night, through some of the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire on the Eastern Front. She flew in all-weather rain that soaked through her leather flight suit, snow that formed ice on her goggles and wing struts, fog so thick she could barely see her wingtips. She flew when other pilots refused, when commanding officers said conditions were too dangerous. She developed a reputation for accepting the most difficult targets. Ammunition dumps surrounded by flak batteries, railroad junctions lit up like football stadiums, command posts buried so deep behind enemy lines that return was uncertain. Her navigator through most of the war was Katya Ryabova, who sat in the rear cockpit with a stopwatch, a map, and absolute faith that Nadezhda would bring them home. They communicated through hand signals and by shouting over the engine noise, and they developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's movements. When searchlights caught them and every instinct screamed to dive away immediately, Nadezhda would hold course for 4 more seconds, giving Katya time to release the bombs exactly on target. Then she would throw the biplane into turns so tight that both women would gray out from the G-forces, slipping and skidding through cones of searchlight beams while tracers stitched patterns around them. The physical toll was immense. Pilots suffered from chronic exhaustion, flying night after night without adequate sleep. Their hands developed permanent tremors from gripping the control stick through hours of turbulence and evasive maneuvers. Their hearing deteriorated from constant engine noise. Many developed respiratory problems from breathing exhaust fumes in the open cockpit. Frostbite was common in winter, when temperatures at altitude dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the women had only leather flight suits for protection. Nadezhda lost feeling in 3 fingers on her left hand after a particularly brutal mission in January of 1943. The sensation never fully returned. The closest calls were never discussed afterward. There was a superstition among the pilots that talking about near misses would invite worse luck next time. But others in the regiment remembered the night a searchlight caught Nadezhda at 4,000 feet and held her for 90 seconds while every gun battery in the sector opened fire, and somehow every shell missed. The night her engine failed on approach and she glided 6 miles back to base in complete darkness, landing the biplane in a field without power, without lights, by feel alone. The night a German night fighter spotted her, a Messerschmitt Bf 1-10 with radar and cannons, and 3 times her speed, and she outturned it in a climbing spiral until the fighter pilot gave up and flew away in disgust. There was the night she flew through her own bomb blast, too low and too slow to escape the shockwave, and the biplane flipped inverted before she could recover at 50 feet above the ground. The night she ran out of fuel over German territory and had to deadstick land in a farmer's field, then hide in a barn until Soviet forces advanced far enough for her to reach friendly lines. The night shrapnel from a near miss severed her rudder cables and she had to fly home using only ailerons and elevator, the aircraft yawing wildly with every control input. She developed techniques that other pilots copied and that were eventually incorporated into the regiment's tactical manual. She learned to vary her altitude unpredictably, never approaching a target the same way twice. She learned to use clouds like shields, popping out just long enough to drop bombs before vanishing again. She learned to fly so low that German gunners couldn't depress their weapons far enough to track her, hedge-hopping at 70 feet in total darkness, pulling up at the last second to clear trees and power lines. Most importantly, she learned to trust her instincts, to sense when a section of sky felt wrong, and to veer away seconds before searchlights snapped on exactly where she would have been. The war ground on. The regiment moved westward as Soviet forces pushed into Poland, into Germany itself. The landscape below changed from Russian steppe to Polish farmland to German industrial cities. The targets changed too. Early in the war, they attacked supply depots and troop concentrations. Later, they struck railroad marshalling yards, communication centers, SS headquarters. By 1944, they were bombing targets inside Germany proper, flying deeper into enemy territory than anyone thought the obsolete biplanes could reach. Nadezhda was promoted to squadron commander, then deputy regimental commander. She received the Order of the Red Banner twice, the Order of the Red Star twice, the Order of the Patriotic War First Class. Her uniform jacket became so heavy with medals that she joked she could barely lift it. Other pilots completed 200 missions and were rotated to rear areas, given instructor positions or staff jobs. Nadezhda kept flying. 300 missions, 500 missions, 700 missions. The Germans put a bounty on her head. Specifically, any pilot who shot down Nadezhda Popova would receive an immediate Iron Cross, Germany's highest military honor. Radio broadcasts from German positions mentioned her by name, warning anti-aircraft crews to be alert for her aircraft. But the mathematics of probability are strange in war. Perhaps she survived precisely because she flew so many missions that she developed instincts other pilots never had time to acquire. Perhaps the sheer audacity of flying a cloth and wood biplane against the Wehrmacht created a kind of psychological immunity. German soldiers saw her ancient aircraft and assumed she must be either insane or blessed, and neither should be shot at. Perhaps it was simply cosmic luck, the universe's dice falling in her favor 850 consecutive times. Or perhaps, as some of her fellow pilots believed, she carried some invisible protection, some guardian angel that guided her through the darkness. The final missions came in April and early May of 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. The regiment flew support missions for ground troops, attacking German strongpoints that were holding up the advance. The flak was more concentrated than ever, a desperate last stand by crews who knew the war was lost but kept fighting anyway. Other pilots were shot down during these final weeks, killed so close to the end of the war that it seemed cosmically unfair. Nadezhda flew through it all, her 850th mission coming just days before Germany's surrender. When the war ended in May of 1945, Nadezhda Popova had flown more combat missions than any other woman in history, and more night missions than almost any Soviet pilot, male or female. She had dropped 23 tons of bombs directly on German positions. She had spent more than 800 hours in combat, the equivalent of 33 full days and nights in the air under fire. Her aircraft had never taken a single hit from enemy fire. Not one bullet hole in the canvas, not one piece of shrapnel in the wooden frame, not one hydraulic line severed or control cable damaged. Mechanics examined her biplane after the war and found it in better condition than aircraft that had flown a tenth as many missions. She was 23 years old. She married her regimental commander, another pilot who had flown his own share of impossible missions, and they had 2 children. She never flew in combat again. When journalists asked her decades later how she survived, she would smile slightly and say she had been lucky, just lucky, and then she would refuse to discuss it further. The superstition remained. Talking about survival might jinx someone else. She gave occasional interviews about the war, but deflected questions about her personal experience, preferring to talk about her fallen comrades, about the women who never made it home. The last night witches of the 588th Regiment held reunions every year until the end of their lives, gathering in Moscow to remember friends who didn't return, to tell stories they had kept silent for decades, to marvel that they had survived something that should have killed them all. They would raise toasts to absent companions, sing old war songs, and spend long evenings comparing memories of targets and near misses and the strange beauty of flying through darkness above a continent at war. Nadezhda Popova attended every reunion until she died in 2013 at age 91, outliving the war by 68 years, outliving most of the German soldiers who had shot at her, outliving the Soviet Union itself, outliving even the memory of the war in the minds of most people who had not lived through it. She died peacefully in her sleep, the way none of her comrades expected any of them would die, having cheated death 850 times in darkness above a burning continent, having flown through hell without ever getting burned.